said in a low, distinct, suspicious voice, "What are those stains upon his dress?" All eyes were turned towards the blood upon his clothes. "And here are the same stains upon this stick," said Jasper, taking it from the hand of the man who held it. "I know the stick to be his, and he carried it last night. What does this mean?" "In the name of God, say what it means, Neville," urged Mr. Crisparkle. "That man and I," said Neville, pointing out his late adversary, "had a struggle for the stick just now, and you may see the same marks on him, sir. What was I to suppose when I found myself molested by 8 people? Could I dream of the true reason, when they would give me none at all?" They admitted that they had thought it discreet to be silent, and that the struggle had taken place. And yet the very men who had seen it looked darkly at the smears which the bright cold air had already dried. "We must return, Neville," said Mr. Crisparkle. "Of course you will be glad to come back to clear yourself?" "Of course, sir." "Mr. Landless will walk at my side," the Minor Canon continued, looking around him. "Come, Neville." They set forth on the walk back, and the others, with one exception, straggled after them at various distances. Jasper walked on the other side of Neville, and never quitted that position. He was silent, while Mr. Crisparkle more than once repeated his former questions, and while Neville repeated his former answers. Also, while they both hazarded some explanatory conjectures. He was obstinately silent, because Mr. Crisparkle's manner directly appealed to him to take some part in the discussion, and no appeal would move his fixed face. When they drew near to the city, and it was suggested by the Minor Canon that they might do well in calling on the mayor at once, he assented with a stern nod, but he spake no word until they stood in Mr. Sapsea's parlour. Mr. Sapsea, being informed by Mr. Crisparkle of the circumstances under which they desired to make a voluntary statement before him, Mr. Jasper broke silence by declaring that he placed his whole reliance, humanly speaking, on Mr. Sapsea's penetration. There was no conceivable reason why his nephew should have suddenly absconded, unless Mr. Sapsea could suggest one, and then he would defer. There was no intelligible likelihood of his having returned to the river and been accidentally drowned in the dark, unless it should appear likely to Mr. Sapsea, and then again he would defer. He washed his hands as clean as he could of all horrible suspicions, unless it should appear to Mr. Sapsea that some such were inseparable from his last companion before his disappearance, not on good terms with previously, and then once more he would defer. His own state of mind, he being distracted with doubts and labouring under dismal apprehensions, was not to be safely trusted, but Mr. Sapsea's was. Mr. Sapsea expressed his opinion that the case had a dark look. In short, and here his eyes rested full on Neville's countenance, an un-English complexion. Having made this grand point, he wandered into a denser haze and maze of nonsense than even a mayor might have been expected to disport himself in, and came out of it with the brilliant discovery that to take the life of a fellow creature was to take something that didn't belong to you. He wavered whether or no he should at once issue his warrant for the committal of Neville Landless to jail, under circumstances of grave suspicion, and he might have gone so far as to do it, but for the indignant protest of the Minor Canon, who undertook for the young man's remaining in his own house, and being produced by his own hands whenever demanded. Mr. Jasper then understood Mr. Sapsea to suggest that the river should be dragged, that its banks should be rigidly examined, that particulars of the disappearance should be sent to all outlying places and to London, and that placards and advertisements should be widely circulated imploring Edwin Drood, if for any unknown reason he had withdrawn himself from his uncle's home and society, to take pity on that loving kinsman's sore bereavement and distress, and somehow inform him that he was yet alive. Mr. Sapsea was perfectly understood, for this was exactly his meaning, though he had said nothing about it, and measures were taken towards all these ends immediately. It would be difficult to determine which was the more oppressed with horror and amazement, Neville Landless or John Jasper. But that Jasper's position forced him to be active, while Neville's forced him to be passive, there would have been nothing to choose between them. Each was bowed down and broken. With the earliest light of the next morning, men were at work upon the river, and other men, most of whom volunteered for the service, were examining the banks. All the livelong day the search went on, upon the river with barge and pole and drag and net, upon the muddy and rushy shore with jack-boots, hatchet, spade, rope, dogs, and all imaginable appliances. Even at night the river was specked with lanterns and lurid with fires. Far-off creeks, into which the tide washed as it changed, had their knots of watchers listening to the lapping of the stream, and looking out for any burden it might bear. Remote shingle causeways near the sea, and lonely points off which there was a race of water, had their unwonted flaring cressets and rough-coated figures when the next day dawned. But no trace of Edwin Drood revisited the light of the sun. All that day again the search went on, now in barge and boat, and now ashore among the osiers, or trampling amidst mud and stakes and jagged stones in low-lying places, where solitary watermarks and signals of strange shapes showed like spectres. John Jasper worked and toiled, but to no purpose, for still no trace of Edwin Drood revisited the light of the sun. Setting his watches for that night again, so that vigilant eyes should be kept on every change of tide, he went home exhausted, unkempt and disordered, bedaubed with mud that had dried upon him, and with much of his clothing torn to rags. He had but just dropped into his easy-chair, when Mr. Grewgious stood before him. "This is strange news," said Mr. Grewgious. "Strange and fearful news." Jasper had merely lifted up his heavy eyes to say it, and now dropped them again as he drooped, worn out, over one side of his easy-chair. Mr. Grewgious smoothed his head and face, and stood looking at the fire. "How is your ward?" asked Jasper after a time, in a faint, fatigued voice. "Poor little thing! You may imagine her condition." "Have you seen his sister?" inquired Jasper, as before. "Whose?" The curtness of the counter-question, and the cool, slow manner in which, as he put it, Mr. Grewgious moved his eyes from the fire to his companion's face, might at any other time have been exasperating. In his depression and exhaustion, Jasper merely opened his eyes to say, "The suspected young man's." "Do you suspect him?" asked Mr. Grewgious. "I don't know what to think. I cannot make up my mind." "Nor I," said Mr. Grewgious. "But you spoke of him as the suspected young man. I thought you had made up your mind." "I have just left Miss Landless." "What is her state?" "Defiance of all suspicion, and unbounded faith in her brother." "Poor thing!" "However," pursued Mr. Grewgious, "it is not of her that I came to speak. It is of my ward. I have a communication to make that will surprise you. At least, it has surprised me." Jasper, with a groaning sigh, turned wearily in his chair. "Shall I put it off till to morrow?"